Hello, today I'm going to show you how to complete the disclosures page of your application in the Provider Management module for Vermont Medicaid. Every enrollment type is going to be presented with the disclosures page. You are required to self-disclose as the enrolling provider. As you scroll down on this page, you're first going to notice some disclosure details. You want to read over our Privacy Act notice statement, as well as the ownership and controlling interest information and the information about the disclosures forms. Down below, you're going to notice a series of forms. If you are enrolling as an individual within a group or an OPRA provider, you are only going to have the provider self disclosure. You will not have these other four disclosure forms. And the reason for that is that you work for an organization, and that organization is required to fill out the other disclosures. So you simply will fill out your provider disclosure. For all other enrollment types, you are going to need to action each one of these disclosure forms in order to be able to continue on with your application. You'll notice that you have a status of new starting out for each one of these, and we need each status to say completed in order to be able to move on. So we're going to start with our provider self-disclosure. And in order to action this, I'm going to hit create new on the line item. This is going to bring me up a blank provider self-disclosure. You'll notice at the top of your disclosure form, it's going to list the information from earlier on in the application, either your legal business name or your provider name, along with your tax ID or social security number. Below that, we're going to ask you a series of questions. You'll notice that all of the questions are defaulted to yes, so you want to make sure to read over each question very carefully before you make your decision to either keep it as a yes or select no. If your answer is yes, you'll notice that there is a box below each question. You're going to need to provide additional details as to why you answered yes to that particular question. If your answer is no, you're going to select the no radio button and that box is going to disappear. I'm going to go through and action each one of these questions as I'm quite familiar with them, but you want to make sure that you're reading through each question very carefully before making your selection. You'll notice that some of the questions actually have a section that you're going to need to fill out, not just a box. So for this question specifically, you'll notice that if my answer is yes, I need to actually create a new form here to complete that requirement. So just make sure that you are completing everything that's necessary dependent upon how you answered the question. So I'm just going to continue through here answering all of the questions within each section. I'm going to make my way down to the general section of this form, answering the first question. And then you're going to notice that we're going to ask you for contact information. This contact information is for auditing purposes. So, for auditing against this information, who should we contact if we have questions? So, I'm going to enter in a name and an address for this individual. And I'm going to tab through the zip code, which is going to allow it to go through the USPS software to validate that address. I'm going to accept the changes by simply clicking on the line item, but if you don't want to accept the changes and you want to stick with what you have entered, you can click on the X button on the top left right-hand corner and it will keep your entry. And then lastly, for this contact, we need to enter in a phone number. So select your phone type from the drop-down and then enter in the phone number. Directly below that, we're going to ask you for another address, and this address is the physical location of where your records are kept. And you'll notice there is a disclaimer stating you cannot enter in a P.O. box because, for obvious reasons, your records are not being kept at the post office. So, this is a physical location of where your records are kept. I'm going to accept the changes by clicking on the line item. And then if we had questions or needed to reach out to you regarding your records, what phone number would we reach out to? So you need to enter in a phone number for that as well. Under that, there will be a few more questions for you to answer, and I want to point out this next question as an example of how it's very important to read over these questions very carefully. This next question says that under the pains and penalties of perjury, I am not in good standing with any and all taxes due. So if you answered yes here, you're stating that you are not in good standing with your taxes. So it's super important that you read over each one of these questions carefully. I'm going to answer no today, stating that I am in good standing. I'm going to answer the last few questions at the bottom. Once you have answered all of the questions and entered in all of the necessary contact information, you're ready to hit save on the provider self-disclosure form. Now you'll notice that back at the disclosures page, my status for my provider self-disclosure is completed. I have completed the requirement. You'll also notice that the Create New button is grayed out, and that's because you can only have one self-disclosure form. I'm going to move on to the next disclosure form, which is the subcontractor disclosure. And regardless of whether you have individuals or entities to report in these sections, you must action each one of them. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the self-disclosure. I'm going to hit Create New, and this is going to open up the subcontractor disclosure form. On these forms for these different disclosure types, you're going to want to read over the information at the very top, which explains what a subcontractor is. So, for instance, on this one, it's saying that a subcontractor is somebody that the provider has had business with totaling more than $25,000 in the preceding 12-month period. If that applies to your situation, if you have a subcontractor that meets that criteria, you are going to want to enter in that information. Whether it's an individual or a corporation, you can toggle between the two. If that applies to you, leave the first question as yes and enter in the necessary information. If the answer is no, you do not have a subcontractor that meets that criteria, on this first question, you're simply going to change it to no. You'll notice that the rest of the form disappears and you're ready to just simply hit save. Now, because I actioned it, it's going to have a status of completed. You may be saying, but what happens if I have more than one subcontractor that meets that criteria? That's perfectly fine because the Create New button is still open. So if you entered in a subcontractor and you saved that first one, and you have another one to report, you can simply hit Create New again. It will bring you up a blank form and you will be able to enter in the next disclosing entity. We're going to do the same thing with ownership and control interest. I'm going to hit Create New on that line item to open up a form. This time, I'm going to read over the top to understand what the criteria is in order to report ownership and controlling interest. And in this case, it's direct or indirect ownership interest totaling more than 5% in the provider. So that is the criteria that you are going to use in determining if you have any individual or entity that you need to report here. The same thing with the previous disclosure form. If that's the case, you're going to choose either individual or corporation and enter in all of the necessary information. If your answer is no, you're simply going to select no and you're going to save. Moving on to managing employees, I'm going to do the same thing. So you'll notice I'm just repeating the process. So for each disclosure form, you need to indicate whether or not you have anybody that meets that criteria or not and action accordingly. I'm going to read over the top, make my determination whether I have anybody that meets that criteria. And in this case, we're talking just about individuals. So we're talking about managing employees within the organization. You have to select relationships for the provider to this managing employee and fill out all necessary information. If the answer is no, you're going to select no and you're going to hit save. And lastly, I'm going to do the same thing for business transaction. I'm going to hit Create New to open up the business transaction disclosure form. I'm going to read over the top, see if I have anybody that meets the criteria, whether they're an individual or a corporation, and address accordingly. I now have a status of completed for each one of these disclosure forms. This is now going to allow me to move on with the application. If you need to review the information that you've already entered, so maybe after you've done completing the application before you submit it, maybe somebody else needs to review all of the information in this application, which will include the information that you filled out for the disclosure forms. If you need to view that information, you can simply click on anywhere here on the line item for one of the disclosure forms that you're looking for. And if you do that, it will bring up all of the disclosures that you have entered in for that particular section. So I'm going to click on the provider self-disclosure, and you'll see here that it's going to give me my self-disclosure. If I want to view the information, I'm going to click on the edit button, and this is going to bring up the information that I have already completed. You'll see here that all of my information has saved, and these are all of my answers that I have given on the disclosure form. Before you submit your application, you can make changes if necessary. If you're viewing one of the other disclosure forms and maybe you had multiple disclosing entities within that section, they will all be listed here just in the same fashion, and you'll be able to edit and review them. Once you've entered in all necessary information for the individuals or entities that meet the criteria in any one of these sections, you're ready to move on with your application. You can hit save and continue.